That's Why. I perché delle generazioni al lavoro. Segreti di inclusione per i giovani in cerca di un'azienda e nuove idee per i manager appassionati di persone. A cura di Giulio Beronia. That's Why. Generazioni al lavoro.
Welcome to That's Why, the first Italian podcast dedicated to HR and new generations. You are listening to the voice of Giulio Beronia, and the column you are in today is Future Ready, where we explore the hot topics in the world of people management with truly remarkable experts. The theme of today is about multi-generational workforce strategies. In fact, the question we would try to answer is why more generations make the workplace more productive. And again, generational diversity is diversity. I won't be alone exploring these issues, but in an excellent company of a person who, although living miles away in Singapore, works daily and cares about generational inclusion just like me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm only too pleased to introduce you Rachele Focardi, founder and CEO of XYZ at Work. She is a global expert and thought leader in the field of multi-generational workforce, future of work, and talent strategy, employer branding, and so on. Thank you very much to be here, Rachele.
Thank you so much, Giulio, for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'm so glad to have you because it's an important theme, this of multi-generational workforce. And my starting point is your latest book. I'm in love with it. Written and published last year. The name is Reframing Generational Stereotypes by McGraw-Hill Asia. And where you show in this book that being aware of each other's needs, challenges, and point of views, even fears, is a key to unlocking the power of intergenerational collaboration. So the first question that I want to ask you is why it should be so important for a business leader, an HR professional, or simply for an employee, reflect and act towards the generational inclusion.
That's a fantastic question, Giulio. Well, we could start by saying that, whenever we find a way for people to collaborate effectively together, it's always a win-win. But I think as we look specifically as what's happening in the world today, I think, our world and businesses, and as a result of that, are facing unprecedented challenges. We have seen it over the past few years. There's been a lot of pressure on the talent market. Organizations are on their way to digitalization. Lots of things are being disrupted. And many of the challenges that companies will have to be facing going forward are not challenges that can be addressed and solved through the standard traditional hierarchical ways of doing business. They are challenges that can only be addressed if organizations are truly capable of incorporating the ambition, the drive, the social mindedness, the tech savviness of all these young generations that we have coming into the workforce, alongside the experience, the institutional knowledge, the wisdom of the generations that are already in the workplace. So now more than ever, it's really important for organizations to be able to unleash the power of their human capital by leveraging on the skills and expertise of their entire workforce.
And do you think that the theme now is on the attention of everyone because of pandemic or because there is a grew upping of this awareness?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. Well, first thing is we're in a particular time in history, and not just because of the pandemic, obviously, but also because we have something that we have never experienced before. We have 5 generations currently working together. You have a lot of traditionalists, the generation even before the baby boomers that are still going strong. You have baby boomers that are working past the age of retirement and staying in the workforce. And then you have an entire new generation, Generation Z, that is just entering the workforce now, and that obviously we know very little about still in relative terms. And so, it's becoming increasingly important for organizations to be able to understand when you have 5 diverse, different generations, all of which have been shaped by, different historical, political, social events that grew up in different times, that started working under different conditions. For all these generations to be able to understand understand each other's mind frames and work together effectively is going to become incredibly critical. All of a sudden, the leader of the future, the leader of tomorrow, is going to have to be able to create the best possible environment for a broad range of people. And this was never the case before.
So, do you think that generation diversity is diversity?
Generational diversity is absolutely diversity, and I'm so glad to be on your podcast here on your show, Giulio. Because I'm a big fan of what you do, and second of all, because I think we need more ambassadors. We need to kind of amplify this message. I am shocked to hear every day so many people refuse to address generational diversity as a diversity challenge. Some even going as far as saying generational diversity doesn't exist. Generations are not real. People should not be bunched under generational umbrellas. But the reality is that, even though these people mean well, they're doing more harm than good, because generational differences are real and they're there. Whether people, say that they should be there or not, they are. And stereotypes are not necessarily a bad thing. They're a way to kind of group us together. And the reality is that if we think of the different generation, even just the pop culture or the access to technology or the concept of leadership that existed when each of us entered the workforce, it was very, very different. So by discounting these differences, I think it makes people feel, a little bit censored in the sense that they're not really able to kind of express and justify these differences and these challenges they experience, and are even made to feel that perhaps there's something wrong with me because I shouldn't be experiencing this. So generational diversity is diversity, and it needs to be addressed, absolutely. And I think it's only by kind of addressing it and taking the hat out of the sand, that the workforce is going to start to understand that there is appreciation for each other's differences, for each other's challenges, but also for each other's strengths, and really start that conversation that will help people once and for all understand one another and combine strengths.
Oh, wow. Very good. Thank you, Rachele, because we are learning that generational diversity is an intangible diversity sometimes. I was asking, I want to ask you, which are the reasons of generational conflicts in the workplace? So, in this diversity and heterogeneous.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't think these are differences that are new to our century or to our time in history. There's a great quote by George Orwell who says, every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that came before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. So I think generational struggles are part of history. I mean, every generation, they say, seems to fix and solve the errors of the previous one. I think what's different now is that we live in a time in history where, and this is something we owe to the millennial generation, to Gen Y, there's a very strong appreciation and understanding for how much young people can actually contribute and bring to the table. I don't think that people today are more capable of bringing to the table innovative ideas than I would have been as a Gen Xer or a baby boomer or a traditionalist. But I think now is the time when people are listening. And so it's becoming really important for organizations to be able to kind of bring these voices in, but also understand how to make sure that the existing generations in the workplace are welcome to receiving, these ideas and working alongside them. So the problem very often is linked to the fact that, new generations come in a little like kamikazes, right? They're empowered now for the first time in history after the millennials. We know that young people matter, that young people can make a difference, that they have important things to say, that they can build great companies. And so all of a sudden they want to be heard. And they strive for change. They strive to be innovative. They want to be able to hit the ground running and come up with new ways of solving problems. And very often they feel that they are kind of prevented from doing that from generations that are currently in the workplace, who have more traditional mindsets, who perhaps are less comfortable with more innovative ways of solving problems, who are less comfortable with parallel processing, who want to really rely on experience and past experiences as opposed to trying new things. And I think this makes everybody feel very frustrated. But I believe, based on my experience doing this for so many years, that there's a very specific point in time when all this began. And if you want, I'm happy to share that with you. But I think that's the main problem, is this kind of desire to do new things quickly, met with the resistance of older generations who often think that, young people don't have enough experience to really know what they're talking about and prefer to do things using traditional ways.
Oh, very interesting. While you were talking, I was thinking maybe it's possible that the marketing issues have the fault of this labeling, because I think that a lot of people start to think I'm into this generation and not in this one, because maybe a lot of marketers started some years ago to divide these clusters of people in a different way of buying, way of thinking.
I think there's a good point. I think that obviously, labels can be a double-edged sword. From my experience, though, working with a workforce, across multiple continents, I always find that there's always a very strong sense of pride that people feel towards the generation they belong in. So even though people may say, oh, your label's a millennial, I've heard very few people tell me I'm not proud to be a millennial. I think the problem comes when the labeling becomes negative, and when the labeling creates these unconscious bias that prevents people from seeing past that. For example, one thing that I am extremely impressed by, and part of the reason why I decided to write my book, is this new generation of Gen Z. I mean, this is a generation of kids that, if you read the news, or if you look at, the typical, stereotypical Facebook posts, are labeled as strawberries, are labeled as, weaklings, are labeled as people who just don't understand and didn't grow up in a time of uncertainty, which, by the way, with COVID could not be further from the truth. But when I speak to them, I encounter kids that are 14, 15, 16 years old, for example, who are incredibly worried about the world they live in, and who are genuinely dedicated to work as a team to be able to solve the problems that we're facing and ensure the continuance or the survival of our world. And when they talk to me, they say, in regards to the workplace, I'm terrified because I feel like I'm screaming from the top of my lungs in a room full of people and nobody's listening. The world is in trouble. Corporation needs to take ownership of this. I need to be able to do something about it, and I need to be able to contribute through the work that I do. Yet when I walk into organizations, they call me a strawberry, they don't listen to me, they tell me I have no experience. And so very often that frustration comes from, why don't you hear me for what I'm saying? I'm not a useless strawberry. I am concerned about the world, and I am willing to do everything that I need to do in order to be able to solve the problems we're facing. And likewise, millennials don't like to be called entitled or to be told they're disrespectful, and baby boomers don't like to be discounted for their opinions just because they disagree with the young generation. So I don't think it's so much a matter of labels. I think every generation is quite proud to belong to the generations that they are in, and they should, because every generation brings incredible things to the table. I think the problem is when we refuse to kind of see past that unconscious bias, past that kind of lens of maybe what our experience have been interacting with people. So these perspectives are not necessarily false. These are really the experiences that people have had with one another. But if you can't see past that into what the potential is, or what it is that everybody can bring to the table, that's when you then have the labeling. And then you have the entitled millennial and the okay boomer, and all these things that, of course, don't help, just make the matter worse.
I really agree. I think that generational issue is slippery in the company scenario, because it refers to the aspects of culture with the capital C. But I read in the book that you have noticed in your studies that baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z have different mindset, expectations, styles of communications, but they have one thing in common that you are saying, they all feel misunderstood. So I'm asking you, which are the common fears in multi-generational workplace? Which are the common challenges? Tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, I think, the solution. I think in there lies the key. Every generation feels misunderstood. And I was really surprised, because when I ran this big study, the XYZ multi-generational workforce study, while writing my book, I asked professionals from all over the world across every level of seniority. I had CEOs and company presidents answer the survey, as well as interns or people that are about to join the workforce. And every generation at least 1 in 2 is very comfortable admitting to the fact that they are intimidated by either the young generation, if they belong to the older generations, or by the older generations, if they belong to the young ones. Concerns and challenges they're facing in regards to their role into the workplace. And I found that to be very fascinating, because when we look at other generations, we always tend to see them as these kind of impenetrable fortresses, right? The older generation, the baby boomers, look at them. They have so much authority. They feel so important. They're so influential. And then look at the millennials. They're so arrogant and confident. And look at Gen Z. They're just coming in with this, desire to change things. And they really, and in reality, we fail to see that behind that lens is a human being, and every human being tends to have fears and concerns. So when it comes specifically to the multi-generational workforce, you will find that there's very significant challenges and struggles that we all face. For example, the baby boomers are worried about overcoming old mental models, about not being technology savvy. So, lacking that technology knowledge that will allow them to remain relevant. They're worried about becoming physically slow, of not learning as quickly as the other generation. They're worried about the idea that their ideas are out of date, and so, are going to be kind of thrown under the rug. They're worried about being treated as a fixed asset and being bypassed for promotion and recognition. And also, they worry about having sufficient energy and creativity to be able to work alongside the new generations who have so much energy and, who demand, obviously, leaders that are, very invested. If you look at Gen X, my generation, the smallest generation in history, the one that kind of tends to be forgotten, we're worried about remaining relevant. We are worried about approaching a new bracket and the bias that is attached to that age bracket. We're worried about hitting a ceiling in terms of advancement and earning potential. And also, we're very worried about being on the cusp, because we're seen as still way too young for executive management, but still too old for the young generations coming in. We also worry about the lack of visibility that we have, because we're considered the lost generation, and people don't seem to care so much about what we have to say. And also about ageism. When applying for a job, I was talking to a Gen X recently who told me, I even if I remain very current in my skills and my attitudes, a 28-year-old with a good set of skills would trump me in a head-to-head competition simply due to age. So I mean, this is not an easy thing to be carrying around. And if we look at millennials, we're, with all their confidence and all their desire to kind of come in and drive change, I mean, they're worried about not being able to get their point across to older leaders. They're worried about now being sandwiched between generations with Gen Z coming in. They're worried about being paid based on years of experience instead of expertise, which is what companies should be moving more and more towards. They're worried about dealing with institutional power, about not having the skills necessary to be able to navigate organizational politics, and also not being respected. And Gen Z, as I said, they fear being underestimated compared to others, not being heard. They fear knowing that the future depends on them, and yet there's very little that they can do about it. They fear being able to actually have sufficient empathy to be able to be equally liked by 4 generations that come before them at the same time. So every generation is worried, and every generation is scared. So I think once we start looking at people that way, you start looking at your tough manager, and you realize that behind that perhaps is also the fear that they may not be as relevant, or everything else that we just discussed. I think that we're much more likely to look at one another with with indulgence, with empathy, with understanding, and with a desire to truly kind of understand where we're coming from. So yeah, absolutely. The workplace is no different than any type of relationship. It's really by understanding what drives us and triggers us, I think, that we can really learn how to work together well.
And another thing that I was thinking, in your studies, in your knowing of the very different companies from all over the world, do you notice that are some difference from different countries? The generational issue is different in USA, from Asia, from Europe?
Well, I mean, it depends of what we mean generational issues. I think that, the generational challenge So the fact that there are 5 generations in the workplace, the fact that organizations and leaders need to be able to learn how to cater to these 5 generations and find a way to unleash their collective strengths and power, the fact that intergenerational collaboration will be the key to saving the world and, organizations ensure organizations survival. All these things are common. The fact that you have new generations coming into the workforce with a need to drive change and be heard, this is common across the world. This may not have been the case when baby boomers or Gen X were into the workplace because technology separated us. So a Gen Xer in Italy may have had no idea what a Gen Xer in Malaysia or in Mexico was going through, right? But nowadays with, globalization, with access to technology, with shared pop culture, I mean, the generational differences between countries are very, very few. So I would say very comfortably that if we look at most emerging markets or even developed economies, the generational traits are very consistent across the board. What is different, of course, is how open people are to actually, breaking down these traditional boundaries and bringing people together. I mean, again, I haven't lived in Italy for many, many years, but as you know, Giulio, I'm Italian. And I have to say that unfortunately, my experience entering the workplace as a fresh graduate in Italy, 20 years ago, was not exactly the best that I could have had if I look at how organizations are dealing with things today. I mean, I was a rookie, I was expected to only make photocopies, and I was expected to bring coffee, and I was expected to be quiet. And, I even remember specifically one time asking my boss if I could please listen into an internal meeting because I wasn't learning anything. And she had me called up by HR because I was overstepping my boundaries and I was too ambitious. And, that didn't speak well and would not do me any favors. And so, that was very frustrating because I do believe that I had a lot of ambition and I think it could have been better challenged. So I don't know if things have changed in Italy since then, but I do know that there's a lot of countries where there's still a lot of, nepotism, or there's still a lot of idealization towards the older generations. In Asia, for example, where I'm currently residing, there's still a lot of concept of, the young generations shouldn't speak up and the older generation should be revered because they're the old wise people that we should all be kind of following and learning from and getting indoctrinated from. But I would say that, I mean, everywhere in the world, it depends. I haven't seen a general approach. I see a lot of very, very forward-thinking leaders everywhere. I see a lot of incredible forward leading organizations everywhere, even in the most traditional markets, if you take Japan as an example. And I see that very often, this revolution is driven by recruiters on the ground who realize that we're losing, traction among the young generations because our older workforce is not embracing them enough. So let's change things. So I see a lot of wonderful, committed leaders across the organization, from the very top to the very bottom, wanting to drive this change. So I don't think that we can really generalize. And I think, big changes start in pockets. So as long as these pockets kept spreading, almost like oil, I think sooner or later, most organizations across the entire world will realize the importance of really bridging and leveraging generational differences instead of suppressing one generation over another.
Thank you very much, Rachele. So let's try to move on to the action plan for the organization that want to create a generational inclusion workplace. Which are the first 3 things to do?
Well, I mean, I think there's 3 big things. Well, the first thing is something needs to be done. And kind of going back, Giulio, just a minute to the whole concept of fear, the employees are not the only ones who are afraid. HR is afraid as well. In my survey, it came out loud and clear that most HR professionals understand that generational diversity is critical and super important. But only 20+% say that the organization is committed to it. And when I ask them why organizations are not committed to it, they say that it's because of fear. Again, they're worried about sounding politically incorrect. They're worried about offending people. They're worried about not really being able to bring everybody under one roof. And so sometimes in this fear of being misunderstood, causes them to kind of not address the issue instead of bringing them up. So I think, the first 3 steps for any organization should be, like you said before, Giulio. Number 1 is accept that generational diversity is diversity, and it's important. And being able to leverage, generational strength is really going to be the key to any organization's success going forward, more than we can even imagine right now. We see it when we look at organizations where you have senior professionals that are leaving large corporate companies to pair with young founders, tech founders, to start the very same companies that I believe will disrupt the big giants in a few years. So, there's a lot of magic there. So the first thing is, again, understand that generational diversity is diversity. Address it, bring it up, talk about it, laugh about it together. Let people know that what they're experiencing is normal, that everybody's going through that everybody has different lenses by which they see the world, and maybe kind of focusing a little bit and bringing those to the surface is actually the way to remove this taboo and open up the conversation. Bringing people together, making sure that people gain understanding of perhaps the reality that other generations have experienced. I think I mentioned this in my book as well, but as I talk to millennials and Gen Zs, they are shocked when I tell them, what I just shared with you. When I joined the workforce, I was told never be authentic. I was told never befriend anyone. Everybody's a competitor. Anything personal that you share is going to come back and bite you. No friendship is going to save you from losing your job if you ever become irrelevant, and so on and so forth. And, I could have expected, 5 years to go by before somebody asked me for my opinion, or 10 years to go by before I got a significant promotion. And these people, when they hear it, they cannot believe it. So, of course, when they meet someone like me in the workforce who perhaps is not as comfortable intermingling, or who perhaps feels a little bit strange by the fact that somebody who was just promoted is already thinking about the next promotion, they're likely to think, see, look at Rachel. See, she is a Gen Xer. She's self-important. She cannot be authentic. She thinks she's better. She doesn't want to watch us grow. But in reality, it's just so different from what I was used to that I'm having a hard time adjusting. So I think, again, generational awareness is critical. And then once that is done, once you manage to start that conversation, and then you can start exploring initiatives, programs, and strategies that you can implement as an organization to bring people together, from shared workspaces to multi-generational teams that operate on collaborative decision making, to reverse or two-way mentoring programs, to shadow boards, which have been in the news a lot lately. So then there's a lot of things that you can do, but the first step is awareness. I always say, Giulio, going as an organization, starting to implement programs and initiatives before people have a chance to learn about one another is like trying to save a marriage by telling the couple to go on dates. It's going to spice things up for a little bit. It may make things interesting. It may give you the feeling that people are getting along. But deep inside, if you don't sit down and address the issues and make sure that the other person understands where you're coming from, it's going to be short-lived. So yeah, absolutely.
Great. But tell me about some brands, the best practice, that have a real intergenerational workplace, and maybe they are recognized for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the great examples that I always love to mention is Group M. The big media conglomerate. I love the story. I was talking to their chief HR officer recently, and they said, listen, in India in particular, and I think this is something that can be rolled out anywhere in the world, we had a challenge. We wanted to address, to hire the best of the best from the top schools, but we also understand our audience. And we know that the young people that come into the organization, if they're going to stay, they want to have impact. They want to be able to work on projects of strategic importance, and they need to be able to be heard, and they need to be exposed to leadership. So that was one thing. The second challenge we realized that we had as an organization is that the people that were making the big decisions were all at the top in executive management. And so these people were very, very far from the ground. And as a business, in order to thrive, we need to understand our consumers. But baby boomers cannot possibly understand the way young consumers think or the way they use technology. So what we needed to do is to think, A, give exposure to the young, wonderful people that are out there to get them to grow within our business. And B, make sure that, the executive committee had access to all this amazing insight that they can only get from the young people that are closer to the ground. But there were too many bottlenecks in between. And so what we did is we decided to create a youth committee. We called it the YCO program, where we actually create a committee of young people that is meant to shadow the executive committee. So all of a sudden, as a business, we have two committees. We have the executive committee of people with tons of experience who know the business inside and out. And we have a committee of young people who've been in the organization for about 12 to 18 months, who are still very fresh and have a lot of innovative ideas. And we get these two committees to work together. And every project of organizational importance, of strategic importance to the business, will be run by these two committees working in parallel. All the projects of strategic importance to the business that involve young consumers will be driven by the youth committee, including upskilling programs in a gamified way, which is something they launched. And the other thing as well is, in this process, we're going to make sure that the young committee mentors the executive committee. So they identify topics that the executive committee members are interested in, which could be how to build a nice social profile on social media, or, let's talk about the future of esports or Bitcoins or whatever. And they schedule sessions periodically where the young generations and the young committee can actually educate the older generations on topics that some may apply to the business, some is just something that they want to learn for themselves, and vice versa. And it's been incredible. I mean, and this really shows a lot of commitment from a company that says, we realize the power of the youth, but we also realize that they need the strength and the knowledge and the wisdom and the ability to remove roadblocks of the old generation. So why don't we bring them together, give them equal voice, and see what happens? And obviously, I mean, that's a fantastic example. We see now companies like Accor, Gucci, and many others, even Unilever, that are thinking about establishing shadow boards. So that's one amazing example. Of course, this is a wonderful example that obviously requires a lot of organizational commitment. So not every organization can go out and say, well, let's launch a shadow board. But I think something that every company can do to kind of mirror this approach is something that I learned from Siemens. And what that is put together multi-generational teams and use collaborative decision-making to solve problems. So you put together people across culture, across backgrounds, across ages. And what you do is you start leveraging on their unique skill sets and expertise instead on their years of experiences. So for example, what the global head of talent acquisition for Siemens told me is, he said, we had a really big project that we needed to run. We needed to innovate our entire talent acquisition function. And we had to do it in 1 year. And if we had only relied on our older engineers, based in headquarters, this would have taken at least 5 years. So I had to put together a team that was able to combine everybody's strengths. It wasn't easy. But the great thing is what we did is, we aligned everybody behind a shared goal. Because at the end of the day, everybody wants to be successful. So if everybody's sharing the same success, everybody's much more likely to want to work together. And then what we do is we identify competencies. The young generations, he said, for example, they were very good in coming up with very simple solutions to problems and using technology super effectively. But the older generations, they understood the business. They could anticipate what problems these solutions would encounter within the business, and were uniquely skilled to remove the roadblocks and network within the organization to get that necessary buy-in. And, it took a lot of challenges at the beginning. I mean, the company even had to hire coaches to help people kind of, break down their barriers and get comfortable with this way of working. But after, he said, and I love this quote, but he said, once everybody realized that they should rely on each other based on expertise, because everybody was extremely competent in their own field instead of years of experience, the magic happened. And they started loving working together. And I know that nobody in that team would ever want to go back to a traditional way of doing business, because, what young talent doesn't want to feel like they're part of a team where they can have tremendous success alongside more experienced leaders? And what leader doesn't want to feel like they're still so relevant and they can actually be so impactful and significant in helping these new generations drive change? And so, being able to bring these generations together, stripping the hierarchy, removing titles, and just getting people to work together based on what they're good at. And then, of course, showcasing within the business how amazing innovation can come out of this. Drove a significant amount of changes. And then I think, it becomes easier to then go back to the business and say, hey, look at this. This may have not been a huge project of strategic value to the business, but I did it. I put together a small intergenerational team. I stripped hierarchy and look at what we came up with and look how happy people are to work together. I think it's going to become easier then to be able to expand those teams and make the project more and more significant. So this is another great example. And then, of course, you have reverse mentoring programs like we discussed in shadow boards, or something I like even more, which is two-way mentoring, where someone is, mentee and mentor at the same time, and many other things that companies can do. But ultimately, I think it's really about being able to bring people together and also, promote a culture where everybody's equally excited to learn. Because frankly, even the young generations, unless they continue to learn and keep themselves updated in today's environment, they're going to become obsolete very quickly. So it's not just the older generations that need to catch up and learn. The young ones need to do that too. So in an environment where everybody's encouraged to learn, I think nobody feels called out. And that's also something else that organizations should start thinking about when they brand these upskilling programs. It's not just the older gens that need it because they're out of date. The entire workforce needs it nowadays.
Wonderful. These are very good examples and very good practice to know and to drill down, because it's very important, the work that you are doing. Rachele, I'm so happy to have heard so many food for thought and new ideas from you, and I hope it was the same for listeners. I would talk to you for hours, and I think that maybe we will have to repeat this experience with other episodes, maybe in the future. I think you are agree. The last things I'm gonna ask into you, our that's why mantra. Some existential questions. Leave an advice to yourself of 18 years old, and another one for yourself of 60, 70 for the future.
That's a really good question. Well, there's quite a few things that I would advise myself about, but I think in relation to this topic in particular, I think that I would probably tell myself to look deeper and further, because I think when I was 18 years old, I didn't know that what I had to contribute mattered. Or would have mattered. I think I was very much indoctrinated in the sense that I was made to believe, not by my parents, thankfully, who obviously invested in my education and pushed me forward, but by the workforce I encountered, that I had nothing interesting and nothing valuable, and I would have nothing valuable to contribute until I gained enough sufficient experience, or until I followed sufficient leaders around to learn from them and replicate what they were doing. And I would love to have known instead that, perhaps it wasn't as frequent, perhaps it wasn't as common, but there were already then, I'm sure, leaders or organizations that I could have found or identified with or connected with, or leaders that I could have connected with to some extent, that would have helped kind of get me out of my shell and make me more comfortable with speaking up. I was made to feel that, speaking up and being ambitious wasn't a good thing. And it was something that would make me unsuccessful throughout my life. And thankfully, I didn't believe it. But I think, not really necessarily given up within myself, but really trying to find people that would be more willing to listen in the workplace, I think would have definitely contributed. I should have fought for it more. I should have fought more for more involvement. And what I would say to my 70-year-old self, and I pray that you record this, Giulio, and send it to me, so when I'm 70, I can listen to it and remember.
Yes, it's your time capsule message. Don't worry.
It's my time capsule message. Let's not make fun of the young generations that come into the workplace. I got kind of really frustrated the other day because somebody posted, somebody very close to me actually, who, I have to say, I thought higher of, posting something, one of those typical posts that says, oh, today's generations, they didn't go through the war, and instead of this, and they're glued to their phone, and instead of that, they're glued to that, and I can't even remember it because it just made me shake. And you know what, the reality is, to every generation, the new generations are going to seem different and are going to seem alien to some extent. I remember, Giulio, one of the biggest fights I had with my grandfather when I was 13 was my love for Michael Jackson. And we used to fight for hours because he said, that's just noise. this singer is not up to anything. It's not like the music from our times. And I mean, looking forward, I mean, this is the king of pop we're talking about, right? So I think way too often generations just, tend to discount the challenges, the struggles that new generations are facing just because they haven't lived them or they don't understand them. So to 70-year-old me, I would say, the same way that the young generations haven't experienced the struggles that you faced, and haven't been in your shoes, the same way you cannot understand the struggles they're facing, and you don't have the option to be in their shoes. So I would probably give them a lot more leeway, a lot more consideration, and probably avoid some of those statements, generations nowadays. I hope I can be one of those 7-year-olds.
Fantastic. For the end, the last question, would you like to suggest a song for our listeners that represent some points or a message that we share together in this episode?
Absolutely. I would love to recommend a beautiful song by Joe Cocker, singer from 9.5 Weeks. And the song is N'oubliez jamais. It's the title is a French title, and it has a beautiful chorus where it says N'oubliez jamais, never forget. I heard my father say, every generation has a way, a need to disobey. And then it says N'oubliez jamais, it's in your destiny, a need to disagree when rules get in the way. And I think it's a beautiful song, and I think it really puts things into perspective. So, and it's also melodically wonderful. So I do suggest your listeners to listen to it.
Thank you very much. So we can go to listen to now, right after this podcast. Well, we are at the end of this episode, and I thank all the listeners and supporters of That's Why. I hope you are running out to your personal and professional life with more doubts than before, but also with some ideas more. Thanks again to Rachele. Thank you very much. You're so precious, and see you soon.
Thank you so much, Giulio. Have a good day.
Goodbye. Info's on. Bye-bye.
That's Why. Generazioni al lavoro.